You have the floor, Professor.
Madam President, distinguished judges, it is an honor to appear before the court and to do so on behalf of the Republic of Armenia. I will be addressing three issues: the prima facie jurisdiction of the court, the plausibility of the rights whose protection is sought, and the link of those rights with the measures requested. The first point, concerning the jurisdiction of the court, does not need an extensive analysis. In its order of 7 December 2021, on the indication of provisional measures in the present case, the court concluded that prima facie it has jurisdiction pursuant to Article 22 of CERT to entertain the case to the extent that the dispute between the parties relates to the interpretation or application of the Convention. This conclusion applies as well to the present request. The plausibility of the rights whose protection is sought. The court, at this stage of the proceedings, is not called upon to determine definitely whether the rights which Armenia wishes to see protected exist. Rather, it need only decide whether the rights claimed by Armenia on the merits and for which it is seeking protection are plausible, and whether the provisional measures requested are linked to these plausible rights. The court has found the plausibility condition to be met when the asserted rights are grounded in a possible interpretation of the treaty in question. In other cases, under the Convention, the court has also examined whether it is plausible that the acts complained of constitute acts of racial discrimination. The present request seeks the preservation and protection of a number of rights under Articles 2 and 5 of CERT for the benefit of ethnic Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh. As it was amply demonstrated by my colleague Mr. Martin, those rights are being infringed by Azerbaijan's blockade and related measures which target ethnic Armenians because they are Armenians. The CERT prohibited discriminatory purpose of Azerbaijan's conduct is obvious from the simple fact that the only human beings benefiting from the Lachin corridor or the public utilities in question are ethnic Armenians. It is moreover indisputable that the disastrous effects of the blockade and related measures are inflicted entirely on ethnic Armenians. In other words, the blockade and related measures are patently discriminatory acts on ethnic grounds. As such, they fall squarely within the scope of application of the Convention as defined in Article 1, Paragraph 1. I shall refer to the plausibility of the rights Armenia invokes under Article 2 of the Convention, and then to the plausibility of rights under Article 5 of the Convention. Rights under Article 2 of the Convention. According to the CERT Committee, and I quote, Article 2 is a comprehensive provision addressing all aspects of states parties' obligation to pursue a policy of eliminating discrimination. The provisional measures request of Armenia invokes particularly the general prohibition of discrimination contained in the chapeau of Article 2.1, together with subparagraphs A, B, and E. The chapeau of Article 2.1 provides that states parties condemn racial discrimination and undertake to pursue by all appropriate means and without delay a policy of eliminating racial discrimination in all its forms and promoting understanding among all races. The specific contribution of this provision is to lend a heightened sense of urgency to the Convention. Subparagraph A prohibits discrimination by the state itself, including public authorities and public institutions. According to this provision, each state party undertakes to engage in no act or practice of racial discrimination. As the Court has observed, Article 2.1 accordingly contains an obligation to engage in no act or practice of racial discrimination against persons, group of persons, or institutions. There is no doubt that the blockade of the Lachin corridor and related measures contradict the general prohibition of discrimination contained in Article 2.1. As already underlined, the blockade is discriminatory in nature. It has both the purpose and effect of impairing the enjoyment and exercise by ethnic Armenians of their human rights on an equal footing with other ethnic groups. This blockade must also be seen against the background of Azerbaijan's conduct since its commencement of the 44-day war, which was unequivocally designed to force Armenians to leave. In this context, the Third Committee has most recently expressed concern about, and I quote the committee, allegations of severe and grave human rights violations committed during the 2020 hostilities and beyond. The committee has also highlighted last August its concern in relation to incitement to racial hatred and the propagation of racist stereotypes against persons of Armenian national or ethnic origin, including by public figures and government officials, end of quotation. This racial hatred and the propagation of racist stereotypes has a distinct purpose: to ethnically cleanse all ethnic Armenians from Nagorno-Karabakh. No ethnic Armenian remain in any of the territories of Nagorno-Karabakh conquered by Azerbaijan during the 44-day war. No ethnic Armenian remain in territories returned to Azerbaijan after the conclusion of the 44-day war. I recall the statement by President Aliyev referring to Armenians in the Lachin corridor. When did you come here? In 1994. Who lived here before then? Azerbaijanis did. So leave. End of quotation. The Armenians did leave after this threatening statement. The blockade is yet another important step fitting squarely in this policy of intimidation. It is aimed at creating living conditions so unbearable for ethnic Armenians that they are forced to leave this area. I recall the statement by President Aliyev dated 10 January 2023. Whoever does not want to become our citizen, the road is not closed, it is open. They can leave, they can go by themselves. No one will hinder them. The road is open. The road is thus open only into one direction. This is the quintessence of the presidential statement. In its memorial, Armenia fully substantiates the myriad wrongful acts constituting ethnic cleansing. In the present context, it suffices to stress that the blockade and its clear and overt purpose, as recently stated by President Aliyev himself, are fully integrated into this long-standing policy of ethnic cleansing. As recognized by the court, the term ethnic cleansing is used to mean rendering an area ethnically homogeneous by using force or intimidation to remove persons of given groups from the area. The practice of ethnic cleansing encompasses a wide range of underlying acts, including acts of intimidation, for instance, through the creation of adverse living conditions. The Third Committee itself has affirmed that practices of ethnic cleansing constitute a grave violation of all the basic principles underlying the CERT. This is especially true in relation to the general prohibition of racial discrimination enshrined in Article 2.1 of the Convention. Seen in its context and against its background, the blockade is the very negation of the obligation to engage in no act or practice of racial discrimination against persons, group of persons, or institutions, in our case against ethnic Armenians. 2.1b shifts the emphasis from discrimination by the state itself towards discrimination by actors backed by the state. Under this provision, states parties undertake the obligation not to sponsor, defend, or support racial discrimination by any persons or organizations. Regarding the verbs in the subparagraph, Sponsor overlaps with support and may be understood in terms of taking responsibility for the acts of another. Support has a wider meaning and may include encouragement, assistance, or approval. In the above-mentioned interview of 10 January 2023, President Aliyev explicitly supported and even defended the blockade and the so-called eco-activists by declaring, I quote, "First of all, I salute those young people. They are a source of our pride. They have been there day and night in freezing and snowy weather, demanding their rights, and once again showing the whole world the high moral qualities of Azerbaijani youth." End of quotation. As my colleague Mr. Martin has amply demonstrated, many of the so-called eco-activists are not private individuals, and all such eco-activists are supported by the government. Such support is clearly incompatible with the obligation of states parties under Article 2(1)b of CERD not to sponsor, defend, or support racial discrimination by any persons or organizations. Article 2(1)e now insists on the obligation of states parties to encourage integration, to eliminate barriers between races and ethnic groups, and to discourage racial division. However, the above statements of approval and support of the blockade and the so-called eco-activists are the negation of the obligation to discourage anything which tends to strengthen racial division under Article 2(1)e of the CERD. It is indeed more than plausible that the encouragement of the blockade of a whole ethnic community perpetuates segregation, thereby strengthening division along ethnic lines. In conclusion on this point, the blockade and its support and encouragement constitute plausible and even manifest breaches of the obligations and the corresponding rights under Article 2(1), subparagraphs A, B, and E of CERD. I turn now to Article 5 of the Convention. This provision is expressly linked to Article 2. It tends to ensure the effective implementation of the general prohibition of discrimination. Among the rights named in Article 5, the provisional measures request of Armenia, as supplemented on 26 January 2023, invokes particularly subparagraph D1 on the freedom of movement, subparagraph D2 on the right to leave and return, including family reunification, and subparagraph E4 on the right to public health, medical care, social security, and social services. I shall examine the plausibility of those rights one by one. Article 5(d)(1) protects the equal enjoyment of the right to freedom of movement. This provision is inspired by Article 13(1) of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This right should be enjoyed without discrimination based inter alia on ethnic or national origin. It is evident that the blockade of the Lachin corridor precludes ethnic Armenians living in Nagorno-Karabakh from moving freely. They are confined in a very limited space, which is the only space in Nagorno-Karabakh where they are allowed to live. Article 5(d)(2) protects the equal enjoyment of the right to leave any country, including one's own, and to return to one's country. This right draws upon Article 13(2) of the Universal Declaration and is found in other international instruments, including Article 12 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Both aspects of this right, the right to leave, and more importantly in this context, the right to return, are the subject of an extensive general comment by the Human Rights Committee. According to this authoritative interpretation, the freedom to leave the country may not be made dependent on any specific purpose. Furthermore, restrictions to the right to leave must be provided by law, must serve a legitimate aim, and must be necessary in a democratic society for the protection of this aim. As explained by the Human Rights Committee, the right of an individual to enter his or her own country recognizes the special relationship of a person to that country and includes the right to remain and the right to return, as well as the right to be reunited with family. The right also implies prohibition of enforced population transfers or mass expulsions to other countries. A fortiori, the right to return implies the prohibition of practices of ethnic cleansing. The persons entitled to exercise the right to return to his or her own country can be identified by interpreting the meaning of the phrase his own country. According to the Human Rights Committee again, the scope of his own country is broader than the scope country of his nationality. It embraces the individual who has special ties to or claims in relation to a given country. In other words, what matters is the factual relationship with the country, irrespective of any question related to nationality or citizenship. The blockade of the Lachin corridor creates a situation which blatantly violates the freedom of movement implied in the right to leave and the right to return to one's country. This blockade is not provided in any law. It is arbitrary. It does not serve any legitimate purpose and, of course, is not necessary in a democratic society. As Mr. Martin has amply demonstrated, families remain separated, given that the blockade was imposed when more than 1,000 civilians of Nagorno-Karabakh were either already in Armenia or en route to Armenia. Among other things, when the blockade was imposed, a large number of ethnic Armenian children living in Nagorno-Karabakh had been attending a contest in Armenia. Some of them were able to return on 19 January 2023, escorted by the Russian peacekeepers. But Azerbaijanis stopped the vehicle and intimidated the children. This grave incident has been largely documented. It clearly demonstrates the obstacles to the right to return, even when escorted by the Russian peacekeepers. Without them, it is simply impossible to return. In conclusion on this point, the blockade of the Lachin corridor, whose purpose is discriminatory, is a clear and in any case a plausible violation of the provisions of the CERT concerning freedom of movement, namely Article 5D, subparagraphs 1 and 2. I continue now with social rights, and more particularly with the right to public health, medical care, social security, and social services, protected in Article 5E4 of the Convention. The statement of protected rights in this subparagraph incorporates rights listed separately in other UN documents, especially in Articles 9 and 12 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights concerning the right to health and the right to social security, respectively. According to the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, the right to health is visualized as related to and dependent upon the realization of a range of other human rights and is understood as a right to the enjoyment of a variety of facilities, goods and services. The CERT Committee has not adopted the general recommendation on Article 5E4. However, a broad understanding of this provision clearly results from different group-related general recommendations and numerous concluding observations. The rights protected in Article 5E4 have been clearly violated because of the blockade. For 50 days now, the people of Nagorno-Karabakh remain under siege. The daily newsletters issued by local authorities report the increasing number of critically ill ethnic Armenians hospitalized in Nagorno-Karabakh who have been slated to be transferred to medical facilities in Armenia for urgent medical care, but for whom the blockade has rendered their free and timely transfer impossible. One of them has already died. Another patient suffering from brain cancer was prevented from undergoing a scheduled surgery last December. When he was finally allowed to exit Nagorno-Karabakh, it was too late for the treatment. Any medicine coming in requires negotiations upon negotiations for Azerbaijan to approve the delivery by the International Committee of the Red Cross or the Russians' peacekeepers. The Ministry of Health of the Republic of Artsakh has warned that local hospitals could soon face a shortage of medicine and other life-saving medical supplies. Hundreds of ethnic Armenians have been deprived of the right to receive necessary medical treatment due to the suspensions of planned surgeries in medical facilities across Nagorno-Karabakh. The blockade is also preventing the import of food and other humanitarian assistance in Nagorno-Karabakh. As Mr. Martin explained, prior to the blockade, approximately 400 tons of essential goods, including grain, flour, vegetables and fruits, were imported into Nagorno-Karabakh from Armenia on a daily basis. Now, due to the discriminatory blockade, there are critical shortages in these essential goods. The authorities were forced to introduce the rationing of food and essential goods through a coupon program. Supermarkets and grocery stores are left with empty shelves. Again, any food coming in requires negotiations upon negotiations for Azerbaijan to approve the delivery by the ICRC or the Russian peacekeepers. With the dearth of food currently in Nagorno-Karabakh, it is truly disheartening to see tons upon tons of goods stored in Armenian border towns awaiting a window of opportunity to be sent to their beneficiaries. In a resolution on the humanitarian consequences of the blockade in Nagorno-Karabakh, the European Parliament has qualified this situation as a severe humanitarian crisis. Timed to coincide with the blockade, on 13 December 2022, Azerbaijan once again cut off the supply of natural gas to Nagorno-Karabakh without any advance warning, leaving homes, businesses, hospitals and schools without heat in the midst of a freezing winter. Medical facilities were forced to suspend scheduled surgeries to save energy and medicine. All schools that use natural gas for heating were shut down. The streets of ethnic Armenian settlements emptied, with local gas stations supplying fuel only to ambulances, public buses and other authorized vehicles. As Mr. Martin explained earlier, the supply of natural gas was restored on 16 December, but since mid-January 2023, it was repeatedly interrupted again and again. As stressed by the European Parliament, this humanitarian crisis has been, I quote, further aggravated by Azerbaijan's disruption of the natural gas supply to Nagorno-Karabakh, which left houses, hospitals and schools without heating. End of quotation of the European Parliament. Furthermore, the deliberate and repeated interruption of the gas supply in freezing winter conditions is combined with the ongoing disruptions of the electrical grid and telecommunication lines in the entire territory of Nagorno-Karabakh. This severely impacts the daily life of the people and leads to a number of adverse humanitarian consequences, such as lack of electricity, disruption of the educational process in schools, disruption of the heating of vitally important institutions such as hospitals, and disruption of businesses. People are deprived of heating and hot water. The authorities were forced to introduce the rationing of fuel. In an effort to save electricity, rolling blackouts were implemented for each household for 6 hours per day. In a report released on 23 January 2023, the Human Rights Ombudsman of Artsakh presents facts regarding the widespread and large-scale violations of the rights of the people of Artsakh due to the deliberate disruption of the normal functioning of Artsakh's vital infrastructures. Such disruption put the civilian population in front of a humanitarian disaster. In conclusion on this point, the blockade and related measures entail a series of more than plausible violations of social rights protected under Article 5(e)(4). In this connection, may I observe, Madam President, distinguished judges, that the third contains a much broader spectrum of rights than the European Convention on Human Rights, which was the basis of the provisional measures ordered last December by the European Court in Strasbourg. Let me briefly turn now to my final point, the link between all the above rights under Articles 2 and 5 of CERD and the measures requested. The provisional measures requested are obviously linked to the rights whose protection is sought, because the measures, if indicated, would safeguard these very rights. Indeed, lifting the blockade of the Lachin corridor and ensuring uninterrupted free movement of all persons, vehicles and cargo along the corridor in both directions would mean the end of the siege of Nagorno-Karabakh, the end of the unbearable living conditions of ethnic Armenians in violation of Article 2(1) of the Convention. Lifting the blockade, ensuring free movement along the Lachin corridor, as well as restoring and refraining from disrupting or impeding the provision of natural gas and other public utilities to Nagorno-Karabakh, would also put an end to a series of discriminatory measures in violation of Article 5 of the Convention. More particularly, it would put an end to the intimidating measures against ethnic Armenians related to the blockade. It would permit the enjoyment of the various aspects of their right to free movement. It would also ensure access of those in need to hospitals and medical care, access to basic goods, food, electricity, and natural gas. In a nutshell, the measures requested, if indicated, would permit 120,000 ethnic Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh to live again in decency. Otherwise, there is an urgent risk of irreparable damage. May I kindly ask you, Madam President, to give the floor to my colleague, Dr. Konstantinos Alonidis, who will be addressing this issue. I thank you for your kind attention.
I thank Professor Sisilianos for his statement, and I now invite Mr. Konstantinos